Alright, today I have for you the next installment in Epic History TV's Napoleon series, Napoleon's Great Blunder, Spain 1808. I've neglected this series a little bit the past week, so this video and the next one will both be Napoleon videos, so please stay tuned, and I will have another one out very soon. But let's go ahead and just dive right into this one. Also, if you hear some weird noises in the background, I have a 12-month-old kitten running around making noises, just as a heads up.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, Osprey Publishing. In the autumn of 1807, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte dominated Europe. He had humbled Austria and Prussia, and sealed an alliance with Russia. Of the major powers, only Britain still defied him, safe from invasion thanks to its powerful navy. Napoleon had ordered all territory controlled by France or its allies to stop trading with Britain, the so-called Continental System, or blockade, designed to wreck Britain's economy and force its government to make peace. But neutral Portugal had continued to trade with its historic ally Britain. So Napoleon sent an army under General Junot to occupy the country and force it into line. The invasion was supported by France's ally, Spain, though privately Napoleon held Spain's rulers in contempt. The Bourbon royal family was decadent and corrupt. The king and crown prince loathed each other, while the country was effectively run by Chief Minister Manuel Godoy, the Queen's lover. Spain, Napoleon concluded, was backwards, militarily weak and incompetently governed, and he devised a plan to seize control of the country. In the spring of 1808, under the pretext of guarding Spain against the British, French troops took up strategic positions around the country. The Spanish people saw the French military presence as the latest in a long line of humiliations, and held Chief Minister Manuel Godoy responsible. There were riots at the palace of Aranjuez. Godoy was nearly lynched. Napoleon invited the Spanish royal family and Godoy to take refuge in the French city of Bayonne, and sent Marshal Murat and 50,000 troops to restore order in Madrid. But on the 2nd of May 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against Murat's soldiers. It became known as the Dos de Mayo uprising, immortalized by the artist Francisco Goya. This scene shows Mamelukes of Napoleon's Imperial Guard attacked by the citizens of Madrid. 100 soldiers were killed. The French responded ruthlessly, shooting down dozens in the streets and executing more than 100 by firing squad. Meanwhile, in Bayonne, Napoleon forced King Carlos to abdicate and bestowed the title King of Spain on his own brother, Joseph. That summer, as Napoleon forced a new modernizing constitution on Spain, and his brother Joseph entered Madrid as its new king, the Spanish reacted with fury. The French weren't just arrogant foreigners trampling on their national honor. They were godless atheists who, during the French Revolution, had rejected the Pope and Catholic Church. Napoleon, priests warned the peasants, was the very Antichrist himself. Revolts erupted across the country. The Spanish army was joined by militias and partisans who attacked French troops and killed collaborators. French soldiers carried out savage reprisals. No mercy was shown. The countless atrocities horrified Francisco Goya, and led to his famous Disasters of War series. At first, it seemed the French would easily put down the revolt. Girona, Valencia, and Zaragoza were besieged by French troops, while the Spanish army of Galicia was routed by Marshal Bessières at the Battle of Medina del Rio Seco. But 8 days later, as General Dupont and 3 French divisions withdrew from Córdoba, slowed down by wagons piled high with loot, they were surrounded at Bailén by General Castaños' army of Andalusia and forced to surrender. The Spanish took 18,000 French prisoners, about half of whom later died of starvation. Bailén was a humiliation for France, her first major defeat since Napoleon became emperor. France's enemies across Europe were delighted. Napoleon was incandescent with fury. The situation went from bad to worse. The Portuguese joined the revolt, while fierce Spanish resistance forced the French to abandon the sieges of Valencia, Girona, and Zaragoza. Spain's new king, Joseph Bonaparte, was even forced to flee the capital. The British assisted the revolt, which the Spanish now called a War of Independence, by shipping weapons to Spain using the Royal Navy. On the 1st of August, a small British army commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal to aid their revolt. On the 17th of August, he beat a small French force at Roliça. Then, 4 days later, beat Junot's main army at the Battle of Vimeiro. But Wellesley's newly arrived superior, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, then agreed to repatriate Junot and his army to France, with all their arms and plunder, using British ships. In Britain, the generous terms were seen as a disgrace and scandal. A subsequent inquiry exonerated Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, but Dalrymple never held command again. Napoleon decided the only way to sort out the situation in Spain was to go there himself. He assembled 130,000 reinforcements, including many of his best troops, and on the 7th of November led a second invasion of Spain. Most Spanish troops were inexperienced, were often badly equipped and led, and their armies had no coherent strategy. They were no match for the Grande Armée, which burst across the Ebro River and inflicted heavy defeats on the Spanish at Burgos and Tudela. At Tudela, Marshal Lannes' Third Corps avenged the defeat at Bailén by smashing the army of General Castaños, sending it fleeing in 2 directions. Napoleon pushed on rapidly. North of Madrid, 8,000 Spanish held the mountain pass at Somosierra. Napoleon, impatient to break through to the capital, ordered forward the Polish Light Horse of the Guard. In an attack of almost suicidal bravery, they charged the Spanish guns head-on and enabled the French to take the pass. 4 days later, after Napoleon threatened to obliterate the city, Madrid opened its gates to his army. Unaware of the disaster engulfing Spanish forces, a 20,000-strong British army, commanded by Sir John Moore, had just arrived in Salamanca after a 300-mile march from Lisbon, with another smaller force en route from Coruña. The British army was inexperienced, but in contrast to most Spanish forces, it was well trained, organized, and led. As news reached Moore of the Spanish collapse, he nevertheless planned to divert French forces by attacking Marshal Soult's isolated Second Corps and threatening Napoleon's communications to Burgos and France. At Saargun on the 21st of December, the British 15th Hussars advanced overnight through winter frost and made a dawn attack on a French cavalry brigade, routing it in one great charge. But as Moore prepared a full-scale attack on Soult's corps, he received news that Napoleon was advancing rapidly towards him with his main army from Madrid.
He's getting into trouble. Sorry, he was getting into trouble. This is Mark Talk, by the way. Let's continue.
Two French corps under Marshal Lannes began a second, bloody siege of Zaragoza. Napoleon saw a chance to get to grips with the British at last. Intending to trap Moore between his own forces and Soult's Second Corps, he force-marched his troops over the icy Guadarrama Pass in the midst of a blizzard. Moore, facing odds of more than 2 to 1, immediately ordered a retreat, planning to march 250 miles to the coast, where his army could be evacuated by the Royal Navy. For both sides, the race to the sea was an exhausting slog through mountains, mud, and bitter cold. Many fell by the wayside as British discipline collapsed, leading to looting and drunkenness, except among the rearguard, which fought several skillful delaying actions and kept the French at bay. Soldiers of Britain's elite 95th Rifles were prominent in these skirmishes. This specialised light infantry regiment wore green uniforms for better concealment, and were one of the few units on any side armed with rifles. Unlike the standard smoothbore musket, rifles had spiral grooves in the barrel that spun the bullet as it was fired, making them slower to load, but much more accurate. In one legendary incident during Moore's retreat at Cacabelos, rifleman Tom Plunkett picked out and shot dead a French general at 400 yards, some say further.
Yeah.
Thanks to the skill of the rearguard and the desperate pace of the retreat, the British kept one step ahead of the French. On New Year's Eve, Napoleon received grave news from Paris. Rumours of plots, and Austria mobilizing once more for war. The Emperor immediately left for France, taking many of his best troops with him, and entrusted Marshal Soult and Second Corps with finishing off the British. The pursuit continued, but on the 11th of January 1809, Moore's ragged army reached Coruña. For Sir John Moore's exhausted army, the Spanish port meant supplies, rest, and the prospect of rescue. But few ships were there to meet them on the 11th. Fortunately, the British had been able to blow up bridges behind them to delay Marshal Soult's advance. And 3 days later, on the 14th of January, the naval transports arrived, allowing Moore to begin embarking his cavalry and artillery. But the very next day, Soult's army appeared on the hills south of Coruña, taking up positions on the heights of Peñasquedo, where he sighted his main battery of cannon. Half of Moore's army deployed in a defensive line 2 miles south of the city, with 2 divisions held back to protect his right flank. Both armies were roughly 16,000 strong. The French had 4 regiments of dragoons, while the British cavalry was already aboard ship. But the broken terrain of walls, hedges, and olive trees made it a battlefield ill-suited to cavalry. Soult's plan was to attack the British right flank and trap Moore's army against the sea. Around 2 p.m, the French artillery opened fire. Then Mermet's infantry division advanced, supported by La Houssaye's dragoons on his left. Moore had been unsure if Soult would attack, and had just ordered Paget's division to begin embarkation. Now he hurriedly cancelled that order, ordering Paget instead to bring up his men to reinforce his open flank, and Fraser's division to take up position on the heights of Santa Margherita. The French advanced through hedges and over walls, with heavy firing from skirmishers on both sides. Then the British counterattacked. The 42nd Highlanders and 50th Foot charged into the village of Elvina and drove the French out. But in confused fighting, they in turn were soon pushed back to their own lines. Sir John Moore was close to the front line, observing developments, urging on officers and men. But as he ordered up the Guards Brigade to reinforce the line, he was hit in the shoulder by a cannonball. He remained conscious, but it was obvious the wound was fatal, and he was carried back to the city. Soult sent forward Merle's division to support the attack on Elvina. Scottish General Sir John Hope had taken over command of the British army from the dying Moore, and he ordered forward 2 battalions of infantry to meet the French attack. Paget's division, led by skirmishers of the 95th Rifles, arrived to shore up the British right flank. The terrain was so bad for horses that French dragoons chose to dismount and fight on foot, but were slowly pushed back by the British. Paget's advance threatened the flank of Mermet's attack on Elvina, and he too was forced to withdraw, while an attack on the right by Delaborde's infantry secured a foothold in the village of Piedra Longa, but got bogged down in heavy skirmishing. Around 6 p.m, dusk fell, and firing died out across the battlefield. News that the British line had held reached Moore shortly before he died in Coruña, around 8 p.m. That night, the British lit campfires and posted sentries, then silently withdrew to Coruña to begin embarkation. The next morning, the French found the enemy positions abandoned, but they were slow to take advantage. It wasn't until noon that they were able to bring up 6 cannon and get them into position overlooking the Bay of Coruña. The British had almost completed their evacuation by the time the French guns opened fire. In a hurried departure, a few British transports ran aground, and 2 were set on fire, but overall, losses were light. A small Spanish garrison held Coruña, waiting until the British fleet had escaped to sea, before surrendering. Whether Moore's retreat to Coruña was a British disaster or miraculous escape is still debated. And did he abandon Spain in its hour of need, or draw off Napoleon's main force, buying time for others? Either way, Britain's only army had been saved, and would return to fight another day, while Napoleon now faced the prospect of a long war on the Iberian Peninsula, and renewed conflict with Austria, a war on 2 fronts that would challenge his empire like never before. Napoleon had blundered in Spain, but it was years before the scale of his mistake was evident. Then he would say, "I embarked pretty badly on this affair, I admit it. The immorality showed too obviously. The injustice was too cynical. The whole of it remains very ugly." If you'd like to learn more about the Peninsular War, or any of the...
Yeah, so, I mean, this isn't... no battles in here that I know a whole lot about off the top of my head, but this was definitely a huge bog down for Napoleon, and like you said, he doesn't quite feel it for a while. Doesn't really feel the full ramifications of everything. But this really draws them out, because it does draw his attention away from what's going on in Austria. and ties up some of his army in Spain. He doesn't get the decisive wins that he's used to and that he strives for in Spain. And just the fact that now he was also facing popular rebellion amongst the common people. He wasn't just fighting an army. They go into Madrid and places, and the population is rising up against them, which is not something that they foresaw and not something that they were used to. They were used to fighting an army, and the people just sort of accepting it. But this was a big moment for the British, because until this point, the British never had the chance to actually engage Napoleon on the ground. They were strictly a naval power, but this gave them the ability to face Napoleon on the ground and even sort of assess how everything was for themselves. And as they say, the British army was pretty inexperienced. I mean, they hadn't fought anyone even remotely close in strength as Napoleon in a while, so that they didn't really have the experience, but they were very well trained, very well equipped. The British always kept up a very good army in case they needed it, but it wasn't quite enough. The lack of experience hurt them. Bringing in those special riflemen was probably what saved them. To be honest, holding them up the rear is what probably saved them. But the campaign in Spain really is sort of it's sort of the Vietnam or the Afghanistan of Napoleon's rise. I mean, whereas we had Napoleon's reign, whereas we definitely see whereas Russia's sort of the nails in the coffin. This is the campaign that never seems to end, and it's a thorn in the side that never really quite goes away. It always ties up part of his military, always takes some of his attention away from other things, even though he still remains very successful for quite a while after this. He could have probably been a little more successful, and it was perfect timing for the Austrians to start. I'm sorry, kidding. To start remobilizing. It was a perfect time for that, because now Napoleon's busy in Spain. He's not paying attention to the rest of Europe. Mobilize now, and then forcing Napoleon to come out of Spain. The British can operate there, and the Spanish could fight them better off, because you're leaving it. Because as we saw before Napoleon showed up, his generals, who are normally very, very good, were not able to do the job that needed to be done. It really took Napoleon to do it. And it's not because his generals were bad or anything. They were very good, but it was, again, you had popular uprising and a very different kind of military that they were facing. The Spanish... So what's a little ironic is that they had a harder time facing the Spanish, who were more poorly equipped and more poorly trained than the Austrians or the Prussians or even Russia or Britain. And you had a harder time against those than they did against those very well-trained, well-equipped armies. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that Napoleon's forces are designed to fight a certain way. And that method is the counter to the standard method used by most major powers, most powerful countries. Spain was not one of those, not militarily. So when they're fighting against Spain, they're fighting against a strategy in which, or even a lack of strategy, depending on how you look at it, but a strategy that is very different than what Napoleon's army was trained to fight against. So it's kind of a rock, paper, scissors, whereas everyone else is paper, Napoleon scissors. Well, now they come out as rock. They're not a very good rock, but it still held held Napoleon's forces down, and it was still definitely effective against Napoleon. And it is sort of similar. That's why I say it's like Vietnam and Afghanistan, both American and Soviet Afghanistan campaigns. In the fact that in those campaigns, not only did they bog down the invading nation significantly for long periods of time, and also lead to not entire disasters for the Soviets, disasters, but they weren't totally disastrous, but they were bad and had lingering effects. But also they were fighting an inferior force. They were fighting, you're fighting guerrillas, you're fighting those who are not as well trained, not as well equipped, who do not have the funding, do not have the manpower that you have. They don't have any real advantage at all, except that they are fighting on their home turf. We saw that with the Viet Cong, we see it with the Afghanis, and those that would be fighting in Afghanistan. Many of them were not Afghanis, but we saw that against in both the Soviet and American campaigns there. So there's still a similarity to that he's fighting an inferior force, but his forces are not well trained in how to fight that. Just as, when the United States went into Vietnam, they were not really trained on how to fight against this sort of guerrilla insurgency. They had always fought more traditionally, with armies on battlefields and trenches and all that. They were used to the World War style of fighting, because that's how they fought in Korea too. They weren't used to it, and then the same thing kind of applies with the Soviets going to Afghanistan. The Soviets hadn't really fought anyone major in a long time. They were barely involved in Korea. They didn't send troops really. So the Soviets go with their strategy and their doctrines, and they're fighting somebody that they just don't even know how to fight, because it's so far below what they're used to fighting. But it's so far below, but yeah, it's effective. One of those sort of crazy enough to work kind of ideas, I guess. But yeah, so this was definitely an issue for Napoleon Spain, because not only does it bog him down, but it leaves Portugal unable to be touched. Portugal is allied with, they're neutral in this area, but traditionally they are allied with Britain. If Napoleon were to go after them, Britain would step in. So if Napoleon tries to go in and send in by sea, British Navy's going to be there waiting for him. There's no doubt. So you have to go there by land, and to do that he has to get through Spain. And if he can't get through Spain because he's bogged down, and then the British show up with their skilled soldiers and just further bog down Napoleon's forces, he can't get to Portugal. Portugal's able to do what they want to do. They're able to help the British, and it gives the British sort of a foothold in mainland Europe, a place where Napoleon has not touched yet, and a place that is an ally to them, and they can send troops and they can use it for supplies and trade and everything that they need. So it was definitely an issue for Napoleon. Had he been able to take out Spain, things would have gone a lot smoother for a long time. But not to say that he wasn't successful otherwise, but losing in Spain like this was disastrous. Especially in the long run. At first it didn't seem as bad. It was just it was a thorn in the side. It was problematic, but it would become a growing issue as time went on. That was really the key takeaway from this, is that it's not the decisive win that he wants. It does bog down his forces. It leaves Portugal open and free to do what they want, and that is mostly work with the British. Even though they're remaining neutral at this point, they are still allied with the British and can still be a mainland European place for the British to dock their ships or send troops or whatever. If they wanted to go and fight Napoleon in Spain, as they did, they could go through Portugal. or they could just go in Spain. Like Spain was a mess. They could just land somewhere. Spanish were going to let them in too. But even if Napoleon had taken control of Spain, this sort of gave them a free spot to get in there, and before he was able to take Portugal, they would have the ability to send their own troops and try to defend it. How well that would have worked, who knows, because the British were not really as experienced, but they were very well trained, and they had been paying attention to what Napoleon was doing, so that was very important. But the British will come back and will be fighting on land again. This was sort of the trial run to see how it goes. To call it a blunder for them to sit because they retreated, it really wasn't. It really wasn't, because they got what they needed. They got the experience. They got the first-hand accounts. They were able to really bog down Napoleon further, and they knew that Austria was building up too, and just bogging his forces down really helped. Did they really accomplish everything they wanted to accomplish? No. But they were able to do damage, and they were able to slow Napoleon down, and they were able to really help the bad situation Napoleon was in. Well, not help Napoleon, but help the, I guess, worsen the situation for Napoleon there by making it more difficult, even for a little while. And that was a win for the British. That was a win. It's not quite the win they were looking for, but they were taking it, and it was still a win for them. So I wouldn't have called it a blunder for the British just because they retreated. I mean, they went in, they did a lot of what they wanted to do, and then they got the hell out of there before Napoleon's forces overwhelmed them, which they probably would have. They absolutely would have. The fact that they were able to hold them off that long was actually pretty impressive. It just goes to show how well trained the British were, despite their lack of lack of experience. Had Napoleon in person been there, it would have been different, I'm sure. But against these generals, they were able to hold the line and make that tactical withdrawal that they needed. So anyway, I'm going to end the video there. I do love these videos. I know it neglected a little bit, like I said. This video, then I've got another one coming out. The next one will be Napoleon again. I'm just going to do back-to-back on these. And then I will be doing more very soon. It's a long series, and I want to get through all of it. And I will be doing all of it. So I'm going to end the video there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you want me to check out, please put them in the comment section, and I will be sure to add them to my list of things to watch, and I will see you next time.